Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents A Square Meal, A Culinary History of the Great Depression by Jane Ziegelman and Andrew Coe. Narrated by Susan Ericksen. Prologue. Early on the morning of November 11, 1918, on a railroad car in northern France, a German delegation signed the armistice agreement, signaling the end of hostilities and the complete defeat of the German army, to go into effect at 11 a.m. that day. At 10:59 a.m., the last soldier was killed in World War I. An American infantryman from Baltimore named Henry Gunther, who ignored orders and senselessly charged a pair of German machine guns. When the hour was reached, the guns grew silent on the fields of battle that stretched across the Western Front. For the 1.2 million troops of the American Expeditionary Force, the armistice ended the largest and bloodiest battle in American history, the Meuse-Argonne Offensive, in which 26,000 U.S. soldiers had been killed. The survivors were exhausted and often shell-shocked, suffering from trench foot, fleas, lice, scabies, dysentery, and a host of other ailments. They packed their mess kits, blankets, trench tools, gas masks, and other gear in their field packs, shouldered their rifles, and began their march to the railway lines where they would begin their journeys home. Despite the privations they had undergone, the Americans held one great advantage over both the German enemy and the soldiers of their French and British allies. They were by far the best-fed troops of World War I. The U.S. Army field ration in France varied according to circumstances, but the core of the soldiers' daily diet was 20 ounces of fresh beef, or 16 ounces of canned meat, or 12 ounces of bacon, 20 ounces of potatoes, and 18 ounces of bread, hard or soft. American troops were always proud that they enjoyed white bread, while all the other armies had to subsist on dark breads of various sorts. This ration was supplemented with coffee, sugar, salt, pepper, dried fruit, and jam. If supply lines were running, a soldier could eat almost 4 pounds of food, or 5,000 calories a day. American generals believed that this was the best diet for building bone, muscle, tissue, and endurance. British and French troops consumed closer to 4,000 calories, while in the last months of the war, the Germans were barely receiving enough rations to sustain themselves. Compared to non-combatants, they were relatively lucky. Across the war zones of Belgium, northern France, and Eastern Europe, many thousands of women, children, and old people had starved to death. Away from the front lines, strict rationing was the rule, with barely any meat available to civilians. In the history of Europe, this hunger was nothing new, just the latest in a series of famines that had swept across the continent over the centuries. The U.S. Army owned its stupendous culinary fortune to the richness of the American soil, the hard work of its farmers, and a man named Herbert Hoover. Shortly after the United States entered the war in April 1917, President Wilson asked Hoover, a brilliant mining engineer who was then directing food relief to Belgium, to reorganize the American food system to support the war effort. Operating under the slogan of "Food will win the war," the U.S. Food Administration sold farmers fertilizers at discount prices and encouraged them to expand their acreage and adopt the latest scientific farming practices. Hoover also fixed agricultural prices to avoid inflation and took control of railway lines to ensure rapid shipment of foodstuffs to East Coast ports, where ships were loaded with Maine potatoes, beef and pork from the Chicago stockyards, Dakota wheat, and dried fruits from Oregon and California. If the merchant fleets were able to avoid German U-boats, the food would arrive in Europe to be distributed to Allied troops, hungry refugees in Belgium and northern France, mess halls, field kitchens, and frontline trenches. During the war, the troops' unofficial motto had been "Heaven, Hell, or Hoboken by Christmas." Most had embarked for Europe from the Hoboken docks. If they survived the conflict, they hoped to land again at Hoboken. In reality, the majority of them missed Christmas, at least in 1918, and the ships carrying them home also landed at Boston, Newport News, and Charleston. For the returning, often seasick troops, their first view of American soil somehow seemed to take place early in the morning, in the fog. Nevertheless, their greeting back in American waters, even before they landed, was rapturous. Local governments, newspapers, and anybody else who could chartered boats to race out to meet the arriving ships. When the Mauretania, carrying 3,999 troops, steamed into New York Harbor late in 1918, a police boat carrying the mayor's welcoming committee pulled alongside. After city dignitaries shouted greetings to them through megaphones, the troops who crowded the dock and hung from every porthole bellowed en masse, "When do we eat?" It became a custom for greeting parties to hire professional baseball pitchers to hurl California oranges at the troops. Some soldiers sustained concussions from the barrage to give them their first taste of fresh American produce in more than a year, a prelude to the series of memorable feasts that would mark the rest of their journeys home. After the boats tied up, teams of young women from local Red Cross canteens rushed on board with coffee, sandwiches, and donuts to distribute to the soldiers. The next order of business was a homecoming parade, more than 500 of which were held in cities across the country. The biggest parades were staged in New York City, where Fifth Avenue from the Washington Square Arch north was festooned with lanterns and American flags. At almost every parade, crowds threw gifts of fruit and candy to the passing troops. In Boston, groups of enthusiasts at various points along the route did their best to regale the marching men with fruit, candy, and sandwiches. In some places, these things were tossed from windows just above street level, and, in spite of the best efforts of the soldiers, fell smashing upon the pavement, until the street at such points was littered with samples of various kinds of goodies, from chocolates and bonbons through the small catalogs of packaged goods to oranges and bananas. Traveling in open cars and holding bouquets of welcome, the wounded were also pelted. Their laps were piled high with oranges and sandwiches, and many had bottles of lemon pop, in the enjoyment of which it appeared that flowers were a hindrance. The end of the parade was usually marked by a banquet, formal or informal. To honor the 26,000 troops of the 27th Division, the big New York City hotels offered them the following menu: olives, mixed sweet pickles, grapefruit, fresh vegetable soup, half-roast broiler, boiled sweet potato, green peas, apple pie, Neapolitan ice cream, large coffee with milk and sugar, bread and butter, cigarettes, White Rock. In Newport News, the troops of Maryland's 115th Infantry were given a feast of real Maryland food, including 4,000 pounds of fried chicken, 1,800 soft-shell crabs, crab cakes, ham, biscuits, peas, asparagus, potatoes, oranges, and strawberries, all served by 24 of Maryland's pretty girls. For soldiers whose homes were farther inland, banquets would have to wait weeks or even months before they were finally released from military duty. Although less elaborate, These homecoming celebrations were no less enthusiastic. In Lincoln, Illinois, 20,000 citizens gathered in mid-August heat to commemorate their hero's return with a parade and picnic featuring fried chicken, veal loaf, potato salad, coleslaw, baked beans, pie, cake, and sandwiches. For veterans, of course, their final and most anticipated celebration was their first home-cooked dinner. Many had been fantasizing about this for months, dreaming of such all-American specialties as chicken and dumplings, apple pie, and coffee with real cream. In reality, these homecomings could be difficult. Veterans had been strongly affected by the war. Many had continuing physical and mental problems, and saw that their relatives were complacent and uninterested in their experiences. In John Dos Passos's novel, The Big Money, the third book in his USA trilogy, veteran Charlie Anderson is made uncomfortable by his family's effusive welcome at the St. Paul, Minnesota train station. After returning home, the first order of business is a feast. They had a big dinner ready, and Jim gave him a drink of whiskey, and Old Man Vogel kept pouring him out beer and saying, "Now tell us all about it." Charlie sat there with his face all red, eating stewed chicken and the dumplings and drinking the beer until he was ready to burst. He couldn't think what to tell them, so he made funny cracks when they asked him questions. After dinner, Old Man Vogel gave him one of his best Havana cigars. After a few months of restlessness and conflict with his family, Charlie buys a ticket for a sleeping car berth on the New York train. When he woke up in the morning in the lower berth, he pushed up the shade and looked out. The train was going through the Pennsylvania hills. The fields were fresh plowed. Some of the trees had a little fuzz of green on them. In a farmyard, a flock of yellow chickens were picking around under a pear tree in bloom. "By God," he said aloud, "I'm through with the sticks." Chapter 1. The first sign of trouble was the exodus of young folk, the steady march of rural sons and daughters leaving the countryside for more promising futures in the big city. The migration began in the years leading up to World War I and picked up speed after 1914 as farm-raised offspring flocked to high-paying jobs in urban shipyards and munitions factories. Once the fighting ended, returning soldiers, many of them country boys who had tasted the largeness of the world, now saw the farm as a jail sentence. Some never returned, depriving the farmer of his best workers, his unpaid children. The farmer's predicament found its way into the 1919 vaudeville hit, "How You Gonna Keep 'Em Down on the Farm After They've Seen Paris?" How you gonna keep 'em away from Broadway, jazzin' around and paintin' the town? How you gonna keep 'em away from harm? That's a mystery. They'll never want to see a rake or a plow, and who the deuce can parlez-vous a cow? How you gonna keep 'em down on the farm after they've seen Paris? The jaunty melody belied the seriousness of the question. For many anxious Americans, city drift was a symptom of deeper distress. Despite the goodness of the land and the many virtues of farm living, something was wrong in the American countryside. The rural problem, it turns out, proved a fertile ground for thought, launching a quarter-century of national soul-searching. Through the second half of the 19th century, progressive-era reformers like Jacob Riis and Jane Addams had focused their energies on those social evils born of the modern metropolis. The two items at the top of their agenda, the abuses of the sweatshop system and the dire living conditions found in the tenements, were strictly urban maladies. It now appeared that the countryside was also in need of reform. Like Thomas Jefferson before him, President Theodore Roosevelt saw the American farmer as the beating heart of the nation's moral, political, and spiritual life. The decline of farm life, if it continued apace, threatened both the soul of the Republic and the country's ability to feed itself. In 1908, Roosevelt appointed the Country Life Commission to investigate the failure of country life as it exists at present to satisfy the higher social and intellectual aspirations of country people. After 6 months of research, the Commission's report confirmed what many already suspected. A hobbling malaise had descended over rural America. As to the source of the problem, experts determined it was none other than the farmer himself. In short, the agricultural class was stuck somewhere in the 19th century, prisoner to its own outmoded habits and attitudes. Discussion of the rural problem was taken up by reform-minded church leaders, government bureaucrats, charity workers, and farmers themselves. It even gave rise to its own branch of social science, rural sociology, whose practitioners studied everything that had gone wrong with country life with an eye toward fixing it. Naturally, each group came to the table with its own self-interested point of view. Even so, all seemed to agree that America had essentially divided into city and farm, two separate and largely hostile civilizations. Since the end of the Civil War, the nation's cities had enjoyed a period of explosive growth. Factory smokestacks, the minarets of urban America, shot up along waterfronts, while rows of red brick tenements, housing for the new industrial workforce, sprouted in their shadows. Everyday life in the modern city was defined by the surging intensity of the street, the great shopping boulevards packed with hungry consumers. The cosmopolitan mixing of class and ethnicity, a basic condition of city living, offered daily lessons in sophistication, while city saloons, cafes, theaters, and concert halls promised non-stop amusement. The hallmarks of country living, meanwhile, were isolation and self-reliance. Whatever diversions were enjoyed by country folk were homespun affairs. Box picnics at the local schoolhouse, at-home dances with the neighbors, Sunday dinners with the pastor. The baubles and smart get-ups so admired by urban fashion plates were unknown to rural women who sewed their own clothes, their shopping needs met by the Sears, Roebuck and Company catalog. The advances in technology that were revolutionizing city life had largely bypassed the farm. Deep into the 1920s, country women still hauled their water from outdoor wells, cooked on wood-burning stoves, and lit their homes with kerosene. The family conveyance was most likely still a horse-drawn buggy. In the fields, a team of horses pulled the farmer's plow. Interested observers seized on these differences and used them as tangible examples of the growing rift. A more elusive distinction, however, involved the experience of time. In the great urban centers, the pulse of the factory served as a kind of metronome for the city at large. In the urban workplace, where wages were paid by the hour, efficiency was a measure of success. Factory hands demonstrated their worth by completing the maximum number of standardized motions in a given period. After the factory whistle blew, their time was their own. But even at leisure, city dwellers saw time as a resource, like coal or copper. The fear that time might run out, as every resource will, left them with the dread of time wasted. On the farm, meanwhile, time was not something you stockpiled like firewood. Farm chores took as long as they took. There was no rushing an ear of corn, and the workday stretched to accommodate the tasks at hand. Time was elastic. The minutes and hours that mattered so much to city folk were irrelevant to the drawn-out biological processes on which the farmer depended. In place of the clock, the farmer's yardstick for measuring time was the progress of the seasons. As a result, his view of time was expansive, focused on the sweeping cycles of the natural world. For city people, time was fractured into finite segments like boxes on a conveyor belt. On the farm, time was continuous, like a string around a tree, one season flowing inevitably into the next. For all their abstraction, conflicting ideas of time found concrete expression in the realm of food. Played out daily in American kitchens, culinary tensions began with the kitchen itself, a focus of enduring concern among rural reformers. To the city observer, the most striking feature of the farmhouse kitchen was its unwieldy size. In the second half of the 19th century, when it came time to put up a house, farmers turned for guidance to floor plans printed in agricultural journals and design manuals like Lewis Allen's 1852 Rural Architecture. The kitchen, as envisioned by Allen, was far and away the largest room in the house, a reflection of the many uses it served. Aside from cooking, the chief living room, as Allen called it, doubled as the homemaker's all-purpose workshop, dining room, nursery, and, occasionally, sleeping quarters. Over the following decade, farmhouses sprouted separate dining rooms and sitting rooms, and as a result, kitchens began to shrink. When the shrinking leveled off, however, kitchens were still spacious enough to accommodate a family-sized table, and families could be large. Stove, sink, wood bin, floor-to-ceiling cupboard, and rocking chair. Country reformers shuddered at all that gratuitous floor space. With so much ground to cover, the rural homemaker was condemned to walk miles each day just to prepare family meals. Those steps became the focus of scientific management, a new field founded on the ideas of men like Frederick W. Taylor. A mechanical engineer, Taylor believed that American prosperity was endangered by the awkward, ill-directed, or inefficient movements of man. Armed with a stopwatch, he analyzed work processes in order to find the one best way to complete a given task in the shortest amount of time. Meanwhile, the industrial engineers, Frank and Lillian Gilbreth, pioneered the motion study. Using movie cameras to analyze the worker at his task, they isolated minute gestures, eliminating any that were wasteful. Lured by the promise of increased productivity, factory and office managers embraced what came to be called time and motion studies. Though conceived for the workplace, these studies were embraced by progressive-minded women, mostly urban, highly educated, and well-off, who applied them to the home. Between 1910 and 1930, a flood of books and articles on household efficiency taught homemakers how to save time by standardizing daily tasks and eliminating unnecessary motions. It was found, for example, that boiling an egg could be reduced from a bloated 27 motions to the more svelte 15. Newspaper columns urged women to put themselves on housework schedules, replacing the usual ad hoc approach to cooking and cleaning with more strategic and businesslike tactics. Predictably, domestic efficiency experts were enthusiastic spokeswomen for the new generation of household appliances targeted at the homemaker. A message echoed in the advertisements for vacuum cleaners and electric irons that filled women's magazines and promised to slash her workday. Picking up on the efficiency craze, rural reformers directed the techniques of scientific management toward the traditional American farmhouse, with a special focus on the kitchen. Magazines from Ladies' Home Journal to Thresherman's Review published plans for more efficient kitchens, while the Department of Agriculture issued pamphlets like The Farm Kitchen as a Workshop, proposing that rural women replace the large multi-purpose space with a compact, well-organized room used exclusively for cooking. To quantify what they already knew, in the early 1920s, researchers from the Department of Agriculture equipped rural homemakers with pedometers, devices pinned to the women's aprons or strapped to their ankles that counted their steps as they went about their chores. Among their findings was that one Montana woman walked a quarter of a mile in the course of baking a lemon pie. In a second variation on the time and motion theme, government investigators asked almost 2,000 farm women to keep time diaries, running accounts of time expended over 24-hour periods. The women recorded their daily round of activities on circular clock charts, each circle sliced like a pie into 5-minute segments. Subjects noted how much time was given to house cleaning, to laundry and sewing, to family, and so on. To no one's surprise, the chart showed that farm women devoted the lion's share of their workday to food preparation. On the farm, the one advance women longed for most was running water, an end to all that bucket hauling. The reformers, however, saw no reason to stop at the kitchen sink. With characteristic optimism, they believed that modernity, with all its rewards, was within the women's grasp. Their mission was to empower farm women with the knowledge of what was possible, including smaller kitchens and improved kitchen habits. The main objects of their passion, however, were reserved for new labor-saving devices like gas stoves and electric dishwashers, which they declared indispensable to kitchen efficiency and urged on farm women everywhere. But change came slowly to rural America. Frustrated, reformers blamed the women for what they saw as a failure of vision. In an article promoting step-saving kitchens, one Iowa home economist lamented, "Many times the homemaker deprives herself of conveniences and the home of possible improvements because she waits for someone else to suggest their addition." Other rural observers saw farm women more harshly, depicting them as resigned to their backward existence, prisoners of their own inertia. City newspapers ran features on the plight of the rural women, her long workday and primitive living conditions. One story in the Boston Herald, titled "The Wife of the Farmer, the Woman God Forgot," described her with the following adjectives: faded and work-weary, hidden away in the remote corners, isolated, drudging, and alone. Country homemakers who encountered these pitiful beings in the popular press were outraged and made their feelings known. A Massachusetts woman named Adeline O. Gosling, an editor at Farm and Home, asked subscribers what they thought of the Boston Herald story and other similar reports. In an attempt to set the record straight, close to 10,000 women responded, including this one from Illinois. Lonely? Where is there such an abundance of life as in the country? There may not be crowds of people, but nature makes a grander showing. The trees, the grass, the flowers, the birds, the horses and cattle, even the crickets, locusts, katydids, and frogs all add to the grand symphony of nature. Where are the members of the family nearer and dearer to each other than on the farm? Where do they understand each other better? How many wonderful evenings are spent together with neighbors around the piano and Victrola, singing and dancing? How many pleasant hours are spent driving through the country, going to band concerts or picnics or to church on Sunday? And then there are the telephones and the daily visits of the letter carrier with magazines and newspapers. It is city life that is lonely, where one may travel all day through crowded streets and be among...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?